In the spring of 209 BC, a 26-year-old Roman commander walked into a Carthaginian stronghold that, by every rule of ancient siege warfare, should have taken him weeks, maybe months, to break. He took it in a single day. For centuries afterward, the story told about how he did it involved a Roman god, a vision in a dream, and a sea that obeyed a man's prayers. Almost nobody questioned that story for generations. Almost nobody, except the one historian who actually had access to the people who were standing next to him when it happened. To understand why this siege mattered, you have to go back 2 years earlier to a disaster most people have never heard of. While Hannibal was tearing through Italy after Cannae, Rome was fighting a second, quieter war in Hispania, modern-day Spain, trying to choke off the silver and manpower that kept Carthage's war machine running. 2 Roman commanders led that effort, the brothers Publius and Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio. In 211 BC, within weeks of each other, both were killed in separate battles against Carthaginian forces. Rome's position in Spain didn't just weaken, it nearly collapsed. The surviving troops pulled back north of the Ebro River and held on by little more than discipline and desperation, while the tribes who had wavered between Rome and Carthage began quietly drifting back toward whichever side looked like it was winning. Rome needed a new commander for Hispania, and for a while, nobody wanted the job. The 2 previous commanders sent there were dead, the army was demoralized, and the Carthaginians held a 3-to-1 numerical advantage in the field. According to Livy, when the Senate called for nominations, the assembly fell silent, no one stepping forward to volunteer for a command that had already killed both of its previous holders. Eventually, one man did. Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of the Publius who had just been killed. He was 24 or 25 years old, had never held a major military command in his own right, beyond serving as an aedile in Rome, and technically didn't meet the normal age and rank requirements for a proconsular command. The Senate gave it to him anyway, with full authority over the war in Spain, essentially because no one with more conventional credentials would take the risk. It was an extraordinary gamble on an untested name, and almost everything that follows in this story happens because that gamble paid off. What Scipio found in Hispania when he arrived was a strategic puzzle that no Roman commander before him had managed to solve. Carthage had not one army in Spain, but 3, each commanded separately. One under Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's own brother, one under Hasdrubal Gisco, and one under Mago Barca, another of Hannibal's brothers. Individually, any one of these armies could likely crush the remaining Roman force in Spain. Together, they would have been unstoppable. But they were spread across the peninsula, days of marching apart from one another, and according to Polybius, distrustful of one another's ambitions almost as much as they distrusted Rome, each wary that cooperating too closely with a rival commander might cost him personal glory or political standing back in Carthage. Scipio didn't have the numbers to fight all 3 armies at once, and he knew it. So, instead of attacking an army, he decided to attack a city. And not just any city. That city was Carthago Nova, New Carthage, today's Cartagena on Spain's southeastern coast. It wasn't just another fortified town on the map. It was the administrative and financial heart of Carthaginian power in Iberia. Its harbor sheltered the Carthaginian fleet operating along the coast. Its workshops produced weapons, armor, and siege equipment for the armies in the field. Its vaults stored a significant share of the silver bullion drawn from the rich mines in the surrounding mountains that paid the wages of Carthage's mercenary forces across the entire Spanish theater. And critically, it held hostages, sons, daughters, and relatives of Iberian and Celtiberian tribal chieftains, kept there specifically to guarantee the loyalty of those tribes to Carthage. Whoever controlled New Carthage controlled the financial and political leverage over an entire region. And almost unbelievably, given everything it held, the city itself was defended by only around 1,000 regular troops under a Carthaginian officer named Mago, a different man entirely from Hannibal's brother of the same name, because virtually every other available soldier in Spain had already been dispatched out with the 3 field armies. Scipio moved before anyone on the Carthaginian side could react. From his winter base at Tarraco, he marched his army south along the coast. And according to Polybius, who had direct access to Scipio's own commentaries on the campaign as well as testimony from Gaius Laelius, a senior officer who served at Scipio's side throughout, the army covered roughly 270 miles in just 7 days, an extraordinary pace for an ancient army moving with full equipment, baggage, and siege gear. At the same time, a Roman fleet under that same Laelius sailed down the coast to meet him, timed so that the city would be cut off by land and sea on the very same morning. None of the 3 Carthaginian field armies were anywhere close enough to intervene, the nearest being roughly 10 days' march away. By the time word of the attack could even reach them, the matter would already be settled. New Carthage sat on what was essentially a peninsula, almost an island, bounded by the open sea on one side and by a shallow inland lagoon, the Almerjal, to the north. A narrow strip of land barely wide enough for a few hundred men to stand shoulder to shoulder connected the city to the mainland, and the city itself, according to Polybius, rose across 5 low hills within its walls, each used for different public and defensive functions. That isthmus was the obvious point of attack, and being the obvious point of attack, it was also the most heavily fortified stretch of wall in the entire city. Scipio launched his main assault there anyway, throwing wave after wave of soldiers against it, with ladders and improvised siege tools, not because he expected to break through quickly, but because he needed every defender's attention, and every reserve Mago had, fixed on that single stretch of stone for as long as possible. While that assault ground on through the morning, exhausting attackers and defenders alike, Scipio had already learned something the garrison hadn't accounted for. Polybius records that local fishermen familiar with the lagoon for generations had told the Romans that its water level dropped sharply and predictably whenever a strong north wind blew, exposing a shallow, wadable ford along the city's northern wall, a section the defenders had left only lightly guarded because they considered the lagoon itself to be a natural barrier no army could cross. That same wind happened to be blowing steadily on the day of the assault. Scipio pulled together a second force, waded them through the receding water as the lagoon drained, and put ladders against a stretch of wall that, just hours earlier, had been sitting underwater. Here's the part that almost every later retelling of this story gets wrong, or at least leaves out entirely. Before the assault began, Scipio told his men that the sea god Neptune had appeared to him in a dream the night before, promising to personally part the waters and hand him the city. The story spread through the ranks almost immediately, and Scipio, who throughout his career deliberately cultivated a public reputation as a commander uniquely favored by the gods, never once publicly corrected it. It made for a tremendous piece of battlefield morale in the moment, and an even more powerful piece of personal legend for decades afterward. Polybius, writing a generation later and explicitly drawing on conversations with people who had served directly under Scipio, including Laelius himself, was openly skeptical of the divine version. He pointed out that the tidal and wind information almost certainly came from the local fishermen, not from a vision, and that Scipio simply recognized the moment when natural, observable conditions matched his plan, then let his own soldiers believe whatever version of events inspired them most, In other words, the miracle was a weather forecast, dressed up afterward as a prophecy, and Polybius makes a point of saying so directly, precisely because he had the access to know better, and didn't want the more flattering myth to stand unchallenged. Whatever the men believed in the moment, the tactic worked exactly as planned. The defenders along the isthmus wall, already stretched thin and entirely focused on the assault directly in front of them, had no reserves left to redirect when Roman soldiers suddenly appeared on top of the northern wall behind their own lines. The garrison, hastily supplemented at the last moment by armed townspeople handed weapons in a panic, simply could not hold two separate fronts at once with a force that had been undersized for one. Within hours, Roman troops were inside the city, and according to both Polybius and Livy, what should by every normal expectation have been a long, grinding siege lasting weeks was instead decided in a single day. The scale of what Rome captured inside New Carthage was staggering for its time. Ancient accounts describe extensive stores of silver and gold bullion, much of it the very treasury Carthage had been using to fund its entire war effort across Spain. Roman soldiers found warehouses stocked with catapults of various sizes and other siege equipment, along with the city's shipyard and the warships docked in its harbor. Livy puts the number of free inhabitants taken in the city at around 10,000. And records that roughly 2,000 skilled craftsmen, metalworkers, and shipbuilders, prominent among them, were kept on as state laborers for Rome, with the explicit promise of eventual freedom in exchange for their work. For a Roman war effort that had been starved of resources in Spain for years, it was an enormous and immediate windfall, arriving at the exact moment Rome needed it most. But the most valuable thing Scipio captured wasn't gold or weapons. It was people and what he chose to do with them. Among the hostages held in the city were sons and daughters of Iberian and Celtiberian tribal leaders, representing Carthage's entire system of political control over the local population. Most commanders in his position would have used them exactly the way Carthage already had, as leverage, or worse. Scipio did something different, and Livy preserves one specific episode in detail because it became, almost immediately, part of how Scipio's reputation spread through Spain. Among the captives was a young woman of striking beauty, the betrothed of a young Celtiberian noble named Eleusis. Rather than claiming her for himself, as his own soldiers reportedly expected, Scipio kept her unharmed and under guard, then personally returned her to Eleusis untouched once the young man came forward, asking nothing in exchange. Eleusis, according to Livy, responded by pledging himself and a force of his own warriors to Scipio's service. Word of the episode, and of Scipio's broader decision to release many of the hostages to their families without ransom or political demands, spread through the Iberian tribes quickly. Leaders who had stayed loyal to Carthage largely out of fear, not conviction, began approaching Rome instead. Scipio hadn't just won a battle, he had broken the psychological hold Carthage held over an entire region. And he had done it with a handful of calculated, well-publicized acts of mercy rather than with additional bloodshed. New Carthage itself became Rome's permanent naval and military base in Hispania for the remainder of the war, giving Scipio a fortified deep-water harbor of his own, sitting inside what had previously been Carthaginian territory. Over the following 2 years, he used that base to systematically dismantle Carthage's position in Spain. At the Battle of Bexula in 208 BC, he defeated Hasdrubal Barca's army, though Hasdrubal managed to extract a significant portion of his remaining force and march it over the Pyrenees into Italy, eventually meeting his own death at the Metaurus River while trying to reinforce his brother Hannibal. By 206 BC, at the Battle of Ilipa, Scipio faced and decisively crushed the combined remaining Carthaginian forces in Spain under Hasdrubal Gisco and Mago Barca, effectively ending nearly 2 decades of Carthaginian presence on the Iberian Peninsula. The reputation Scipio built at New Carthage as a commander capable of combining speed, deception, and political instinct in equal measure is precisely what convinced the Roman Senate, only a few years later, to hand him command of the invasion of Carthage's own territory in North Africa, a campaign that would end at a place called Zama in 202 BC, in direct battle against Hannibal himself, and would earn Scipio the name history remembers him by today, Africanus. It's worth sitting for a moment with how thin the actual margin of that one day in 209 BC really was. A divided enemy command structure that couldn't bring itself to cooperate. A weather pattern that happened to hold on the right morning. A handful of local fishermen with generations of practical knowledge that nobody else had bothered to ask about. Change any single one of those variables, and the entire trajectory of the Second Punic War, and arguably the next several centuries of Mediterranean history that followed from it, looks completely different. Empires, it turns out, have occasionally hinged on details far smaller than the armies fighting over them. If stories like this, where the fate of empires turns on a single overlooked detail nobody else thought to notice, are the kind of thing you're into, the channel is called Urbex. No pressure at all, just more of this waiting for you if you want it.